You think you need motivation? That's the first mistake. Motivation is for amateurs, emotional, inconsistent, weak. It shows up when it feels like it and disappears the moment life punches you in the mouth. Strong men don't rely on feelings. They build systems that don't care how they feel. So when your motivation disappears, and it will, the only thing left standing is your habits. And if your habits are weak, you collapse. Simple. Let me make you uncomfortable. Most of you don't lack motivation. You lack identity. You still see yourself as someone who trees instead of someone who does. That's why you keep starting and stopping. You're negotiating with yourself like a coward. Strong habits don't negotiate, they execute. They don't ask, do I feel like it? They say, this is who I am, and then they move. That's the difference between average men and dangerous men. Now let's talk about something deeper. Something most people are too soft to understand. Speaking in tongues. Not in some mystical, weak, emotional sense. I'm talking about power. I'm talking about the language you use internally. Because whether you realize it or not, you're already speaking in tongues. Your thoughts are a constant stream of commands shaping your reality. The problem? Most of you are speaking the language of weakness, doubt, excuses, delay. You've programmed your mind to obey failure. Strong habits rewrite that language completely. You don't hope anymore. You command, you don't try, you execute, you don't feel, you act. That's a different tongue, a dominant tongue, a language built on certainty and control. And once you start speaking it consistently through action, not words, your entire identity shifts. You're no longer the guy who needs motivation. You're the guy who gets things done regardless of the situation. Understand this clearly. Habits are not actions. Habits are identity in motion. Every time you wake up and move without hesitation, you're reinforcing dominance over yourself. Every time you ignore your feelings and execute anyway, you're building power. That's how transformation actually happens. Not through inspiration, but through repetition under pressure. Weak men wait for the right mood. Strong men create outcomes in any mood. You want control? Then stop chasing motivation. Build habits so brutal, so consistent, that even on your worst day, you still move forward. That's how you become dangerous. That's how you separate yourself from the crowd of men who talk big but live small. You're still waiting to feel ready, and that's exactly why you're stuck. The moment you rely on motivation, you hand control of your life to something unstable, unpredictable, and completely outside your command. Motivation is not discipline. It's a temporary emotional spike. Nothing more. It shows up when conditions are comfortable, when your mood is right, when everything feels aligned. But the second discomfort enters the equation, it disappears. So what happens then? You stop. You delay. You make excuses. And then you repeat the cycle like everyone else who never builds anything meaningful. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If your progress depends on motivation, your progress is fake. It's fragile. It only exists when conditions are perfect. And life is never perfect. Real progress is built in moments when you don't feel like moving, when your mind is telling you to stop, when your body is resisting. That's the moment where separation happens. That's where weak men fold and disciplined men advance. You don't rise to your goals, you fall to your systems. And if your system is based on emotion, you will fall every single time. You've been sold a lie that you need to get inspired before you act. That's backwards. Action creates momentum, not the other way around. Waiting for motivation is just a socially acceptable form of procrastination. It feels productive because you're thinking about change, talking about change, maybe even planning it. But nothing is actually happening. You're standing still, convincing yourself you're preparing to move. And that illusion is dangerous because it keeps you comfortable while your life stays exactly the same. Look at your own behavior honestly. On days when you feel good, you might perform. You might push harder, stay consistent, even feel proud of yourself. But what happens on the days when you don't feel like it? When you're tired, distracted, or stressed? That's where the truth shows up. If your output drops to zero the moment motivation disappears, then your foundation is weak. You're not disciplined. You're conditional. And anything conditional is unreliable. Strong men remove conditions. They don't ask themselves whether they feel like doing the work. They don't negotiate with their emotions. They operate on standards. The work gets done because it has to be done. That's it. There's no debate, no internal argument, no delay. The decision was already made long before the feeling showed up. And once you reach that level, everything changes. You stop wasting energy on hesitation. You stop starting over. You build momentum that doesn't break. Understand this clearly. Discipline is not about intensity, it's about consistency under pressure. Anyone can go hard when they're motivated. That's easy. That's normal. The real test is whether you can execute when there's nothing pushing you forward emotionally. That's where identity is forged. That's where you prove to yourself who you actually are. Because at the end of the day, your results are not based on your best days. They're built on your worst ones. Right now, you're training yourself whether you realize it or not. Every time you skip action because you don't feel like it, you're reinforcing a pattern of weakness. You're teaching your mind that feelings come first and execution comes second, and that pattern becomes your default. On the other hand, every time you act, despite resistance, you're building authority over yourself. You're creating a system where action is automatic, regardless of emotion. That's power. That's control. You don't need more motivation. You need structure that doesn't collapse when motivation disappears. Because it will disappear. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And if you're not prepared for that, you'll stay exactly where you are. Starting, stopping, and wondering why nothing changes. You keep telling yourself you're trying, but that word is the problem. Trying is a built-in escape route. It sounds productive, but it gives you permission to fail without consequence. It keeps your identity soft, undefined, and flexible enough to bend the moment pressure shows up. That's why you keep repeating the same cycle, starting strong, losing momentum, and quietly stepping back into the version of yourself you never actually replaced. Your issue isn't effort. You can push hard for a few days. You can get motivated, set goals, even make temporary progress. The real issue is that you never decided who you are. You're operating without a fixed identity, so your behavior changes depending on your mood, your environment, and your level of comfort. One day you act disciplined, the next day you act like none of it matters. That inconsistency isn't random. It's a direct reflection of a weak internal definition. Identity is not something you talk about. It's something you enforce through action. When a man truly decides who he is, his behavior stops being negotiable. There's no internal debate, no hesitation, no emotional bargaining. A disciplined man doesn't wake up and ask himself whether he feels like executing. He moves because anything else would contradict who he is. That level of certainty removes friction. It eliminates excuses before they even form. Right now, you're stuck in a dangerous middle ground. You want the results of a disciplined man, but you still think like someone who needs permission to act. You're waiting for the right mood, the right moment, the right energy. But that version of you, the one who needs everything to align before moving, is the exact reason you're not progressing. You can't carry that identity forward and expect a different outcome. It doesn't work like that. The shift happens when you stop identifying as someone who trees and start operating as someone who executes. That change is not theoretical, it's behavioral. It shows up in small, consistent decisions that reinforce your new standard. You wake up and move without hesitation. You complete tasks whether you feel like it or not. You follow through even when it's inconvenient. Every action becomes proof of who you are, and over time, that proof becomes undeniable. Most people never reach this level because they're too attached to comfort. They want progress, but they also want to keep their old habits, their old mindset, their old identity. That contradiction keeps them stuck. You cannot become someone new while thinking like your old self. You have to be willing to cut off that version completely. No fallback, no excuses, no second option. Look at your patterns honestly. Every time you quit early, delay action, or avoid discomfort, you're reinforcing the identity you claim you want to escape. You're telling yourself, through your actions, that you're still the same person. And your mind believes what you repeatedly show it. That's why nothing changes. Not because you lack potential, but because you keep proving the wrong identity through inconsistent behavior. When you lock in a new identity, everything simplifies. Decisions become automatic. Discipline becomes natural. You stop wasting energy on overthinking because the standard is already set. There's no room for negotiation. Either you act in alignment with who you are, or you don't. And if you don't, you correct it immediately. That level of clarity creates momentum that doesn't break. This is where most people fail. They underestimate how serious this shift needs to be. They treat identity like a label instead of a commitment. They say they want to be disciplined, focused, consistent, but their actions don't reflect it. And until those two things match, nothing changes. You don't become stronger by saying it. You become stronger by living it repeatedly. especially when it's uncomfortable. There's a voice running in your head all day, every day, and you've been treating it like background noise instead of the command center of your life. That's the mistake. That voice isn't passive. It's issuing instructions, setting limits, shaping decisions before you even realize it. And if that voice is weak, everything built on top of it will be weak. You don't rise above your internal dialogue. You obey it. Most people are walking around with a mental script that's filled with hesitation, doubt, and subtle excuses. It sounds harmless. I'll do it later. I'm not ready. I'll start tomorrow. But those phrases are not neutral. They're orders, and your brain follows them. You've trained yourself over time to respond to those weak commands with inaction. That's why you stall. That's why you delay. That's why you repeat the same patterns even when you know better. The dangerous part is how automatic it becomes. You don't consciously decide to procrastinate, default into it. Because your internal language has normalized delay. It has normalized uncertainty. It has normalized being average. And once something becomes your default setting, it runs without resistance. You start believing that's just how you are, when in reality, it's just how you've programmed yourself. Strong men don't leave that voice unchecked. They take control of it. They understand that the language they use internally determines the standard they operate at. If the command is weak, the action will be weak. If the command is sharp, direct, and non-negotiable, the action follows with the same intensity. There's no gap between thought and execution. That's where real control comes from. You need to eliminate uncertainty from your internal dialogue. Words like maybe, later, and I'll try have to be removed completely. They don't serve you. They create hesitation, and hesitation kills momentum. Replace them with decisive commands, clear, immediate, and final. Not because it sounds good, but because it forces your brain into action. You're not suggesting a task to yourself. You're instructing it. This isn't about positive thinking. It's about precise thinking. You're not trying to feel better. You're trying to operate better. Weak internal language is emotional, vague, and flexible. Strong internal language is direct, structured, and rigid. It doesn't leave room for interpretation. It doesn't allow escape routes. It creates a standard that your actions must follow. Pay attention to what happens when you give yourself a clear command. There's less internal noise, less debate, less resistance. You move faster with more certainty because the path is defined. Compare that to when your thoughts are scattered and inconsistent. You hesitate, overthink, and lose momentum. The difference isn't your ability. It's the clarity of your internal instructions. Right now, your mind is either working for you or against you. There is no neutral state. Every thought is either reinforcing discipline or reinforcing weakness. Every phrase you repeat internally is either building structure or creating excuses. And the more you repeat it, the stronger it becomes. That's how patterns are formed. That's how identities are built. You don't fix this by waiting for better thoughts to appear. You fix it by actively rewriting the script. You catch the weak language the moment it shows up, and you replace it immediately. No delay, no tolerance. That level of awareness is what separates controlled minds from reactive ones. You stop being a passive observer of your thoughts and start directing them with intention. Once that shift happens, everything tightens up. Your actions become faster, cleaner, more consistent. You stop leaking energy through overthinking and hesitation. You stop negotiating with yourself. And when your internal voice becomes sharp enough, disciplined enough, dominant enough, it doesn't just influence your behavior, it defines it. You're not stuck because you lack potential. You're stuck because you repeat the wrong things every day. That's the reality most people avoid. They chase intensity, they chase big moments, they chase sudden breakthroughs, but they ignore the one mechanism that actually builds power: repetition. Not occasional effort, not random bursts of discipline, controlled, consistent repetition that doesn't break under pressure. That's where dominance is built. Every action you take is a vote for the person you're becoming. Not sometimes, every single time. When you act with precision and follow through, you reinforce strength. When you hesitate, delay, or quit, you reinforce weakness. There is no neutral ground. You are always training yourself. The only question is what direction you're moving in. Most people don't realize they're building a system. They just don't like the results of the system they've created. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Inconsistency is not a small problem. It's the entire problem. You can't build anything stable on an unstable foundation. You might have days where you perform at a high level, where everything clicks and you feel unstoppable. But if those days are followed by periods of inaction, distraction, or laziness, they don't mean anything. They don't stack. They don't compound. They reset. And you're back at the same starting point, convincing yourself you're making progress when you're actually cycling in place. Strong habits remove that instability. They create a fixed pattern that runs regardless of your mood, your environment, or your level of comfort. That's what makes them powerful. How they don't rely on external factors. They operate internally, automatically, without negotiation. You don't wake up and decide whether to follow them. You follow them because that's the standard you've enforced through repetition. Most people fail at this stage because they underestimate how strict repetition needs to be. They think showing up occasionally is enough. They think effort here and there will eventually lead to results. It won't. Repetition only builds power when it's consistent. If there are gaps, if there are excuses, if there are moments where you allow yourself to break the pattern, you weaken the entire structure. You're telling your mind that the standard is flexible. And once it becomes flexible, it collapses. Repetition under pressure is where the real transformation happens. It's easy to perform when everything is aligned, when you're rested, motivated, and focused. That doesn't prove anything. The real test is whether you can maintain your habits when conditions are against you, when you're tired, distracted, or dealing with stress. That's where discipline becomes real. That's where control is built. Because in those moments, you're not relying on emotion. You're relying on structure. You need to understand the compounding effect of this. Small actions, repeated daily without interruption, build momentum that becomes difficult to stop. It starts slow, almost invisible, but over time it creates a level of consistency that separates you completely from average behavior. You're no longer reacting. You're executing on a system that runs whether you feel like it or not. That's where you gain an edge. Not through talent, not through luck, but through relentless repetition that others are too weak to maintain. Look at your current habits honestly. The things you do every day, those are shaping your future more than anything else. Not your goals, not your plans, not your intentions. Your habits. If they're weak, your results will be weak. If they're inconsistent, your progress will be inconsistent. There's no way around it. You don't outperform your habits. You reflect them. This is where control becomes real. When your habits are locked in, you don't rely on willpower to make decisions. You don't waste time thinking about what to do next. The system handles it. You move from one action to the next with precision because the pattern is already established. That removes friction. It removes hesitation. It removes doubt. And once that system is strong enough, it doesn't just support your progress. It enforces it. Even on days when you're off, even when your energy is low, even when your focus isn't perfect, the habits carry you forward. They don't allow you to fall back to zero. They keep you moving step by step until momentum returns and performance rises again. You've been trained to believe your feelings matter more than your actions, and that belief is quietly destroying your progress. The moment you start prioritizing how you feel over what needs to be done, you lose control. Feelings are unstable, inconsistent, and easily influenced by external factors. They shift based on your environment, your energy, your mood, even the smallest inconvenience. If your output depends on something that's unstable, your results will always be inconsistent. Most men operate like this without realizing it. They wake up, scan their emotions, and decide their level of effort based on what they feel. If they feel motivated, they move. If they feel tired, they slow down. If they feel stressed, they stop completely. That pattern creates a life where progress is optional, and comfort becomes the default. It feels natural, but it's weak. It hands control over to something that should never be in charge. Strong men flip that structure completely. They don't ignore their feelings. They just refuse to let them dictate action. There's a clear hierarchy. Standards at the top, execution in the middle, emotions at the bottom. That order never changes. The work gets done because it aligns with the standard, not because it feels good in the moment. That's what real control looks like. It's not about being emotionless. It's about being in command. Look at the gap this creates. One man waits until he feels ready, energized, and focused before taking action. The other moves immediately because the task is non-negotiable. Over time, that difference compounds. The first man builds a pattern of delay and inconsistency. The second builds a pattern of precision and reliability. Same potential, completely different outcomes because one is driven by feeling and the other is driven by structure. You need to understand how deceptive feelings can be. They don't just influence your actions. They justify your inaction. When you feel tired, your mind creates a story to support stopping. When you feel overwhelmed, it convinces you that delaying is logical. When you feel unmotivated, it frames inaction as temporary, harmless, even necessary. But those justifications are not objective. They're emotional distortions designed to keep you comfortable. That's why relying on feelings is dangerous. It creates a feedback loop where comfort is constantly reinforced. The more you listen to those emotional signals, the stronger they become. You start believing that acting only when you feel good is normal. And once that pattern is established, breaking it becomes difficult because your mind resists anything that disrupts comfort. Strong habits cut through that entire loop. They remove the need to evaluate your emotional state before acting. The decision has already been made. The task exists, so it gets done. That simplicity eliminates hesitation. You don't waste time negotiating with yourself. You don't sit there debating whether you should act. You move immediately because the standard demands it. There's a level of freedom in that structure that most people don't understand. When you stop relying on feelings, you remove unpredictability from your life. Your performance becomes stable. Your output becomes consistent. You know exactly what you're going to do regardless of how you feel. That clarity reduces mental noise. It sharpens your focus. It allows you to operate at a higher level without being dragged down by emotional fluctuations. This is where discipline becomes visible. Not in moments of intensity, but in moments of resistance. When you don't feel like moving, when your energy is low, when your mind is looking for an exit, that's where your habits either hold or collapse. And if they collapse, it's because they were never strong enough to begin with. Real discipline doesn't disappear under pressure. It shows up stronger. You're not trying to eliminate feelings. You're putting them in their proper place. They exist, but they don't lead. They follow. Your standards come first, your actions enforce those standards, and your feelings adjust over time. That's how you regain control. That's how you build a system where progress is consistent, not conditional. You say you want to become a certain kind of man, but your daily actions tell a completely different story. That gap is not small. It's everything. You don't get judged by your intentions, your plans, or your words. You get judged by what you repeatedly do. And right now, whether you admit it or not, your behavior is exposing the truth you've been avoiding. You're not where you want to be because you're not acting like the man you claim to become. Most people live in this contradiction without ever confronting it. They build a mental image of themselves, disciplined, focused, in control, but their actions don't match it. They delay tasks, break commitments, avoid discomfort, and then still expect progress. That's not ambition. That's self-deception. You can't hold a powerful identity in your mind while feeding it weak evidence through your actions. The mind doesn't respond to what you say. It responds to what you prove.
Every day.
You're presenting evidence to yourself. Not occasionally. Constantly. When you follow through, you reinforce strength. When you hesitate or quit, you reinforce weakness. And over time, that evidence builds a case that becomes your identity. That's why you feel stuck. Not because you lack ability, but because you've built a pattern that contradicts the person you're trying to become. You need to stop tolerating that mismatch immediately. There's no neutral zone where you can say one thing and do another without consequences. Every time your actions don't align with your standards, you weaken your own authority. You make it easier to break commitments the next time. You reduce your own credibility in your own eyes. And once that credibility drops, discipline becomes harder because you no longer trust yourself to follow through. Strong men operate differently. Their words and actions are aligned. If they decide something, it gets done. Not because it's easy, not because they feel like it, but because their standard doesn't allow inconsistency. That alignment creates power. It builds internal trust. When you know that you execute what you decide, hesitation disappears. You don't question yourself. You don't doubt your ability to follow through. You move with certainty because your past actions have proven it. Right now, your biggest problem is not lack of knowledge, it's lack of alignment. You already know what needs to be done. The tasks are not complicated. The path is clear. But you're not executing consistently enough to turn that knowledge into results. And until you fix that, nothing changes. More planning won't help. More thinking won't help. The only thing that matters is whether your actions start matching your standards. This is where most people break. They want to upgrade their identity, but they don't want to upgrade their behavior at the same level. They want the image without the discipline behind it. That doesn't work. Identity is not something you claim. It's something you earn through repeated action. Every day you either build it or you damage it. There's no pause button. You have to raise your level of accountability. Not externally, but internally. You need to start treating your own commitments as non-negotiable. When you say you're going to do something, it gets done. No excuses, no delays, no adjustments. It's based on mood. That level of strictness is what rebuilds trust. It's what closes the gap between who you are and who you say you are. Pay attention to the small moments. The decisions that seem insignificant, whether you follow through on a task, whether you push through resistance, whether you choose discipline over comfort. Those moments define you far more than big occasional efforts because they happen daily. And whatever you repeat daily becomes your baseline. Once your actions start aligning with your standards, everything tightens up. Your confidence becomes real, not imagined. Your discipline becomes stable, not temporary. Your identity becomes clear, not confused. You stop needing reminders, motivation, or external pressure. The system runs because you've proven to yourself that it does. At the end of the day, motivation is a spark. Habits are the engine. And if your engine isn't built, that spark means nothing. So stop pretending you're waiting for the right moment. You're not waiting, you're avoiding. Fix your habits, rewrite your internal language, and become the man who doesn't need motivation because he is the system. And if that truth bothers you, good. It means you're finally starting to see how weak you've been and how much work you actually have to do.